Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome to the Global Security Outlook. The Outlook sessions, as the name suggests, is about thinking where are we heading, what's happening 2016 and beyond, and this panel is on global security. We had, as we started the World Economic Forum, a global security context session, and reflecting on a few years that we now had behind us, where we saw two trends developing quickly and dramatically. The first trend is the trend towards increased fragmentation, loss of trust, loss of social cohesion. Many societies unable to deal properly with governance, with maintaining political order and maintaining a sense of being in the same boat, which of course leads to a number of consequences, but in the more extreme version, the rise of violent extremism, or the option for people with violent intent to capitalize on this fragility. And the opposite trend, which seems unrelated but actually is closely linked, is that we see between key powers on the planet an increasing competition over influence. At times, that competition meets the areas of fragility in such a way that we see conflicts that are local, national, regional, and global at the same time, connected between these two trends. We have a stellar panel with us, and I will introduce them as they give their first intervention. I would like to start with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. Jens Stoltenberg, former Prime Minister of Norway, has been here several times, but it's the first time he's here as the Secretary General of NATO. Happy to have you with us. And one thing that we discussed in a previous session, which I think is very relevant for this one, is what we can call the blurring lines between war and peace, the complexity of actually understanding what is war and what is peace today. And I know you've been thinking about that, as this is very relevant for your job now. What's actually happening, and what is this word hybrid war that we're seeing more and more on the agenda?
I think what's actually happening is exactly what you said. That is, before we had some kind of idea that it was either peace or war. But now more and more countries are living in a state which is in some way in between. And that is about this blurring line between war and peace. We see it when we have frozen conflicts, many places in the world. We see it when we have hybrid warfare, as we have seen, for instance, in Ukraine, with a mixture of military and non-military means of aggression, with deception, with overt and covert actions. And of course, also terrorist attacks is also a part of a mixture of peace and war, and especially when it comes to cyber warfare, it's actually possible to wage war in a time of peace. And this is really creating some new challenges for all of us, and especially for NATO. Because we have to be agile, we have to be prepared, we have to be ready to be able to respond to a much more complex and difficult security environment. And what we see is, to the east of the alliance, we see a more assertive Russia, actually using hybrid warfare in Ukraine. And to the south of the alliance, we see turmoil, terror, non-state actors posing also a great threat to all allied nations. And NATO is responding, and it's also great to sit there together with Secretary Ash Carter, because the US is leading, and it's great to have a Secretary of Defense which is so focused on the transatlantic bond which NATO represents. So our challenge is to respond to a more fragile and more dangerous security environment.
I will move further to Ashraf Ghani, the President of Afghanistan, an old friend of the forum, and a person occupying probably one of the most complicated jobs in the world, but still keeping an optimist approach. You are just in the middle of much of what we're talking about. And Afghanistan, unfortunately for the people of Afghanistan, has been there quite a while in this intersection between fragility and competition. What have you learned? What are the things you will tell us about the security outlook from here and into the near future?
Thank you. Well, the first thing is we need to understand that we are dealing with medium-term challenges, not short-term challenges. Because if the challenge is not defined in the correct horizon term, we cannot put together strategies for containment and for overcoming. Second, terrorism, morally reprehensible, has become a sociological system. We need to understand it as an ecology where there's both competition and cooperation. Third, it has a distinctive pathology, and it is directed towards theater. The attack on Paris, Istanbul, the rest. What's the purpose? To prevent us from freedom of travel, to make us suspicion of our neighbors, to call into question the very bond between the state and the citizen, where the state protects the citizens. And lastly, it has a morphology. It changes very fast. It learns the techniques are transferable. In this environment, what is the other side of the ledger? The state system is weak. We are very privileged, and I'd like to thank both the Secretary General and Secretary Carter. The international level of understanding is remarkable, and let me pay tribute to all the men and women from 40 countries, but particularly from the United States, who paid the ultimate tribute. We honor them. But the regional dimension is missing in action. Unless all the states in the region realize that this is a common threat, and we need to get the rules, and we need to cooperate with each other, we will be exacerbating. What cannot be permitted is for states to behave like non-state actors or to sponsor malign non-state actors. Last point, we're a people of resilience, and we will overcome. Afghanistan will be the burying ground of Daesh and all the rest of them. Don't challenge us. We have a proverb, revenge is sweetest when it takes place 100 years.
Thank you very much. And before we go on, what do you see as the prospect for getting this regional alignment to deal with issues which are fundamentally transborder and can only be dealt with when countries cooperate? How are you doing?
Well, the first issue is, at the global level, the news is good. 40 countries under the very able leadership of the Secretary General and Secretary Carter have renewed their commitment in Afghanistan. Uncertainty is an enemy. Last year, part of our problem was that we had uncertainty. We had a year horizon. Once we've extended the horizon and the staying power is determined, strategies can be focused. Second, there's the question of differentiation. We need to differentiate each of the elements, each of the drivers of insecurity, and be able to deal with them. Thirdly, it is absolutely necessary to focus on the people. We cannot have corruption, we cannot have mismanagement, we cannot neglect the poor and the excluded. Anything that perpetuates misrule, bad governance, or exacerbates poverty. In here, markets are missing. The greatest missing element in the strategy of counterterrorism is the role of the market. Our greatest weakness is weak market institutions. And prosperity cannot be generated just from top down. It needs to be done with functioning institutions. So the private sector, my message to the private sector is, you can be great partners in this effort to create stability through creating prosperity.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let's move, let's stay in Asia, but move to the Southeast Asia, to Singapore. Deputy Minister Tharman, quite to the contrast of where Afghanistan comes from, Singapore is seen as one of the most stable countries in the region, but you are not immune to the challenges that you are seeing, and we were just discussing even in Singapore.
Well, Singapore is the most religiously diverse nation in the world. We have every major religion. The largest is only 1/3 of the population. We have every major religion that is at conflict with another globally within our 720 square kilometers. For us, multiculturalism, multi-religious compact has been part of our identity and part of the rules of the game from the time we became a country. Because if we didn't have it, we wouldn't have survived. We wouldn't have survived. But we are not immune, and we are now having to work harder than ever before to preserve that compact, to keep that spirit of peace, tolerance, and more than peace and tolerance, that spirit of respect, that wanting to engage with each other in day-to-day life. The problem will be with us for a long time to come. I think we can't be wide-eyed about this. It'll be with us because even with the vast majority of Muslims in our region, not just in Singapore, but in our region, with a vast majority finding terrorism abhorrent and wanting to live in a multicultural context. Even with that being the case, we will face terrorism and that threat for a long time to come, because 0.01% of 230 million people in our region is 23,000 people. And we know what 23 people can do. South Asia, about 350 million, if you're just taking the Muslims alone, and we're not counting the Hindus. That's 35,000 people. So the problem will be with us for a while, despite the fact that the vast majority find it abhorrent against their beliefs and the way they want to live their lives. Plus, I think we have to accept the fact that many of those who are being converted to terrorist causes are now coming from the most advanced countries, from Western liberal democracies. And we are living with the legacy of decades of segregation and a culture of exclusion. Rules can be changed, but culture can't be changed quickly. This problem will be with us for a while. And it means that we have to take this as a long game, build resilience. We need to strengthen our defenses, and that's not just talking about the military, that's talking about the state needs strong powers of surveillance, it needs powers of preventive detention, and you need clear rules against hate speech. Those are compromises to preserve the larger liberty of living in an open society. We need some compromises backed by judicial authority, of course, not untrammeled state power, to preserve the larger liberty of living in a liberal society, open liberal societies. But more than that, far more fundamental, we've got to find ways of integrating people from the time they're kids to the time they're at the workplace, where they live, and everyone having that shared hope in the future. That's been central to our strategies, and we're working even harder at it. Mixed neighborhoods are critical. A workplace where you don't have an insider-outsider problem is critical. And most of our labor markets globally now still have an insider-outsider problem. And it's not, as the economists would say, just about incumbent workers versus new workers. The outsiders are the young immigrants and women. And if you're young and an immigrant and a woman, you're completely out. So the insider-outsider labor market is completely at contradiction with immigration, and we have to resolve that problem. Neighborhoods have to be mixed, job markets have to be open, and education has to be education for people, kids in the same classroom together.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. Secretary Carter, can we come back to the phenomenon of hybrid war?
Sure.
How has war changed? I think even over the very few last years, war appears as a somewhat different phenomenon than what we used to read about in the history books.
First of all, I'm in agreement with everything my distinguished colleagues have said here. And in another era, in times past, perhaps a U.S. Secretary of Defense or a security official, a Secretary General of NATO, were worried about and committed to preventing and succeeding, if it came to that, state-to-state conflict. And we still face that and the threat of that in many places. The Korean Peninsula is one immediate example. But as has been said here, and I don't expect this day to end, as society grows more complex and interconnected and therefore essentially more vulnerable, and as destructive power falls into the hands of smaller and smaller groups of humanity, this problem of the few against the many as a security issue, I expect to be with us for a long time. And so as I think about the future of the U.S. Department of Defense, as I do all the time in addition to current operations, that's going to be a preoccupation of my successors, and our job is to deliver security to the people in the face of that fact. Now, it kind of has two aspects to it, as has been said. One is terrorism, which is sub-state actors wielding that destructive power. Unfortunately, there are also states that use the same instruments and the same vulnerabilities for more traditional purposes. And that's true whether it's little green men in Ukraine or, as to be blunt about it, and something we've objected to, actors in China stealing intellectual property and not being apprehended and stopped from doing it in China, to the Iranian government aiding Houthis or contributing to Hezbollah, this kind of thing also. That's what hybrid warfare is. So there's terrorism, sub-state, and hybrid warfare. Both of these are part of the security landscape, and we can't be vulnerable to either of those. Now, when it comes to state actors, one has some more traditional tools available, and like our NATO alliance, we have to do things differently. We have a new playbook for NATO. It's not going to look like it did during the Cold War days, but still has to stand strong for common defense. But I expect this to be part of our responsibilities for a long time. It is what we owe our people. That's why we're here, and we can do it. But it's a very different kind of job from the way my predecessors way back needed to do my job, and these gentlemen needed to do their jobs.